This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, at this final session. And welcome our panelists. And we are looking forward to their contributions. Just permit me to make a few observations before I give the floor to them. A few years ago, an organization was founded in Cape Town for decriminalization of prostitution. And the Public Health Department of Emory University decided to work with that organization. And someone from the department at the time contacted me and asked me if I would like to be part of the program where they would be working with these people. And I said at the time, I don't feel like doing that because I can't find comfort in my own mind for the decriminalization of prostitution, because that would only enhance the position of the pimps. And it reminded me when I was a student, I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was, I visited Belgium and was quite surprised to see that there was state-sponsored prostitution in Belgium. And it surprised me because the Belgian, that you might know, is more Catholic than the Pope himself. But it was explained to me by a friend that in this way they can control and constrain the spread of venereal diseases. And so the participation of the Emory Department of Health in the program in Cape Town was also because they believed that this could counteract the spread of AIDS. Because if prostitutes think they are going to be prosecuted and contract AIDS, they will not reveal that. But in this program, they thought that this could help in the fight against AIDS. But I had no comfort with that. Secondly, in the early 1990s, a very ambitious young lawyer, Gary Hogan, founded the International Justice Mission, stationed in Washington, D.C., which has an elaborate program for the counteracting of human trafficking, particularly in Malaysia. And I had the advantage of serving on their board of advisors for a few years and was very impressed by the wonderful work they did in Malaysia to prosecute, to get the authorities to prosecute those people that benefited from human trafficking and used children, mostly abducted from Nigeria, as prostitutes in Malaysia. Finally, I had a student a few years ago who was doing a project on decriminalization of prostitution. She was against it, but she cited statistics that were gathered where a simple question was asked to prostitutes: what would you have what will you most likely want to have in life? And 95% of those interviewed said to get out of this trade and lead a normal life. And so with these few introductory remarks, let me introduce you to our panelists. Melissa Farley, Executive Director of Prostitution Research and Education. Liesel Gernsholt, Executive Director of the Women's Rights Division and a member of the Human Rights Watch Executive, and by the way, a former student of mine. She was in my property law class at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Good to see you here. And Susan Kopich, nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the US Senate as the Ambassador at Large for the Office of Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons in the United States. And let me just say, finally, that as you all know, the United States is the only country in the world that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but the United States did ratify 2 protocols to the convention that deals with child pornography and the trafficking of people, and that the United States has bound itself by those protocols, though they haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and this is quite encouraging. Our first panelist, please.
Good afternoon. Always tricky to have the graveyard panel. But I'd like to start by thanking Chelsea and her team for a wonderful day of very rich, sometimes provocative, always interesting discussion. So thank you for convening us all, for choosing the topic, and for the very professional way that you've put together the seminar. Thank you to Emory for hosting this, and also to the Thrower family for their continued support for this space. So as Professor van der Veef has said, my name is Liesl Gernthals, and I'm the head of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. I am not going to talk about prostitution. I'm going to talk about sex work. And I realize that that's a loaded and imperfect term, and often a very contested term. But it is the one that ultimately the organization that I worked for, through a process of developing an internal policy on sex work, believed was most consistent with our understanding of the human rights dimensions of sex work. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Human Rights Watch does, because it is the framework through which I want to explain what our policy is, how it has shaped our work, and why we believe, as I've said, it is the approach most consistent with the international human rights framework. So Human Rights Watch is one of the biggest civil society nonprofit organizations working on human rights both globally and in the US. We have a staff of about 400, about half of which are based in the US, and the other half are based all over the world, from Asia to Africa to Latin America. And we have a very simple methodology. We document human rights violations, and we work with victims of human rights violations and their allies to do targeted and strategic advocacy to hold perpetrators accountable for violations. Every year, we produce over 100 reports on about 80 different countries on a vast spectrum of human rights issues, from child marriage to sexual violence in conflict, to the human rights dimensions of climate change, to issues relating to religious freedom. Human Rights Watch research has repeatedly shown sex workers are a particularly vulnerable group, routinely subjected to abuses, and often with little or no recourse to justice. Human Rights Watch recognizes that it is women, including transgendered women, who carry out the vast majority of sex work, and so women are disproportionately impacted by these abuses. We recognize that gender issues of structural inequality impacting on economic, educational, and security opportunities for women, and the systematic, pervasive, and long-standing discrimination play significant roles as to why sex work is predominantly a female sector. Human Rights Watch has conducted research on women and others in sex work in multiple countries over many different years, and our researchers and advocates have sought to promote the rights of sex workers strictly within the confines of international human rights obligations, which neither require states to criminalize sex work or to decriminalize it. And until our policy, which we adopted in 2013, our recommendations included calls to ensure that criminal law provisions do not impede access to health services or otherwise interfere with the right to health. Sex workers do not experience violence at the hands of the police or third parties and have access to effective remedies when they are victims of abuse. Individuals forced into sex work are not exposed to any criminal sanctions or other penalties. Law enforcement and judicial personnel are trained to treat sex worker cases without discrimination or bias. Laws do not provide broad latitude for arrest and detention without a warrant, and have clear, strict limitations on situations where an arrest without a warrant is permissible. Laws on sex work are not overly broad and vague, so that they may not be invoked in an arbitrary manner. However, based on our body of research, Human Rights Watch came to the conclusion that our recommendations did not go far enough and were not robust enough to achieve the protection of the rights of sex workers to which they are entitled and for which we strive. So what did we hear from sex workers, service providers, law enforcement, family members, community and religious leaders, and a range of other interlocutors that we interviewed over the course of several years of doing this work? So we have engaged with a diverse group of sex workers and sex worker advocates from all over the globe. They include international and regional networks of sex workers and national sex worker organizations throughout Europe, Central, South, and Southeast Asia, Africa, the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and advocates that work closely with them. Our work shows that sex workers' experience and work context is equally diverse. Sex workers may be nationals or migrants. They may do street-based work or work indoors. They may work independently or be affiliated with agencies, massage parlors, brothels, or pimps. And their situation is often not static, as they may do sex work sporadically, seasonally, and/or in addition to other labor. Many have experience in labor sectors other than sex work. And I want to share with you some of the things that we've documented. We've documented violence at the hands of the police. We've documented the confiscation of condoms as evidence of prosecution. We have documented arbitrary arrest and detention. We have documented police extortion. We have documented violence at the hands of pimps and clients. We've documented discrimination in access to healthcare, including with respect to HIV prevention, treatment, and care. We have documented discrimination in access to housing. We have documented the inability of sex workers to access protection of the law, and we have documented the intimidation of NGOs or health workers because of their connection to or work with sex workers. So, what this research has shown is that criminal restrictions on sex work imposes structural barriers that threaten a range of rights, including the right to equality, to security and bodily integrity, to the highest standard of health, the right to association, and to organize. Sex workers report to us that to avoid arrest, detention, assault, or harassment, they may avoid public services and government authorities, even to seek redress for violence or other harms against them. Globally, sex workers and their representative organizations and allies have expressed strong support for the decriminalization of sex work. The strong call for decriminalization was echoed in United Nations guidelines that sought, after consulting both groups working on health, equality, sex worker organizations, sex workers themselves, the United Nations, in the form of the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, the United Nations Population Fund, adopted guidelines that recommended the decriminalization of sex work. So I want to say a word here just about LGBT sex workers, because I recognize and we acknowledge that sex work is gendered and that the vast majority of people who undertake sex work are women. But I think we have also documented how other groups are involved in sex work, and I want to talk a little bit about their experiences. The experiences of LGBT people involved in sex work are not always reflected in the debates about the pros and cons of decriminalization. Indeed, the vast majority of laws and policies designed to regulate sex work often only mention women. LGBT sex workers can be amongst the most marginalized and experience serious abuses of their human rights. Human Rights Watch has documented abuses against transgendered sex workers in Cameroon, Honduras, and the US, and LGBT sex workers in Tanzania, China, and Cambodia. Our research on LGBT involvement in sex work reveals a couple of things. One, that sex work involving LGBT people does not always fit into a classic gendered understanding of sex work involving empowered men and disempowered women. Two, sexual minorities who are already socially marginalized experience the additional burden of being criminalized for sex work in ways that renders them particularly vulnerable to exploitation, violence, lack of access to healthcare, or access to justice. And finally, transgender women and men in particular have often very limited employment opportunities due to social stigma. Due to social stigma. And sex work is often a means to self-empowerment and active agency. Indeed, some of the people that we have interviewed from these groups report a high sense of agency when engaged in sex work. LGBT sex workers in many places face heightened risks where sex work is criminalized because they are highly vulnerable to HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. They often have very little control over these risk factors because of their social marginalization and because their identities are often criminalized. In countries where same-sex behavior is against the law and gender transition in any form is against the law, criminalized identity, coupled with criminalized work, makes LGBT sex worker doubly and sometimes even triply marginalized, and therefore less likely to access HIV services or justice mechanisms when they are abused. Laws that criminalize sex work can exacerbate police targeting of transgender men and women. Under the guise of enforcing anti-prostitution laws, police may in fact target transgender persons because they are more visible than their male or female counterparts. So in 2013, as I've said, based on the understanding that the international human rights framework did not mandate either criminalization or decriminalization of sex work, and believing based on our research that we needed an internal policy to guide stronger recommendations and to assist our researchers in understanding better what would support the human rights of sex workers, Human Rights Watch adopted a policy on decriminalization. And let me say that this is an internal policy. It is a policy that gives guidance to researchers and advocates at Human Rights Watch. It's not a public policy, and it is based on our understanding and interpretation of existing international human rights standards. I'm happy, you won't find it on our website, as I say, it's an internal policy, but I'm very happy to share electronically or in hard copy. I have one with me for anyone who'd like to take a look at it. But essentially, what the policy says is that we believe that individuals who engage in sex work are entitled to protection under all recognized human rights standards. Now, that may seem rather trite to you, but as I hope I've described in the early part of my presentation, there are many, many jurisdictions where the fact that you're engaged in sex work allows the state to take away some of your human rights. It allows the state to arbitrarily arrest and detain you. It allows service providers to decide whether or not to allow you to access healthcare, and it allows other services to be denied to you and sometimes to your family members purely on the basis that you're engaged in sex work. So we start our policy with acknowledging the really basic premise that sex workers are entitled to the full protection of all recognized human rights standards. We believe in the decriminalization of all voluntary consensual sexual relations amongst adults. So this policy is part of a broader policy that advocates for the decriminalization of same-sex sexual relations, that recognizes that adult consensual sex should be something that is not regulated by the state. We don't take a position on whether countries can regulate sex work beyond decriminalizing it. We recognize that if the state chooses to apply restrictions, these have to comply with international human rights law. They have to be for a legitimate purpose. They have to be appropriate to meet that purpose, and they have to be proportionate and non-discriminatory. We don't take any position on, at this point, whether or not criminalization of buyers of sex work would be consistent with international standards. So I've been given the nod that I've got about 5 minutes left. So I want to just run you through some of the reasoning underpinning this decision. We believe that this policy allows us to acknowledge that sex workers have a right to privacy and self-determination. We believe that the policy recognizes that sex workers have a right to agency and to organize. It is consistent with improved security, with the realization of the right to health, and it is consistent with some of the sources that we have relied on with regard to human rights standards that are so-called soft law, because as I've said before, the human rights framework currently does not take a position on whether you should criminalize or decriminalize. We looked very carefully, as I said, at the UNAIDS guidelines on HIV and human rights. We looked at some of the expert reports on sex work, for example, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, and a range of other documents produced primarily by regional and international human rights bodies. We believe that, as I said, that decriminalization will protect the full range of sex workers' human rights. We believe that decriminalizing will be helpful in terms of addressing a number of related ills, such as trafficking. Decriminalization of sex work preserves criminal penalties for trafficking or forced or underage prostitution and abuses against sex workers. It removes the criminal punishment and may help to minimize discrimination and stigma against sex work. Sex workers can, and have, as our research shows, played a key role in fighting trafficking into forced prosecution, as they are often well placed to identify trafficked persons, gain their trust, organize with peers and with law enforcement to combat trafficking, or otherwise change an unsafe and unhealthy working environment. Decriminalization is also more likely to promote the willingness of sex workers to identify themselves as part of the industry and to report trafficking. As I've said, we have not taken a position on the criminalization of the buying of sex. I will, however, note that UN experts have pointed out that the criminalizing of buying of sex may well have negative consequences for the health and human rights of sex workers, as the criminalization of all sex work. Let me close by saying that I recognize that this is a difficult issue. As I and my colleagues at Human Rights Watch, particularly those of us who have done the interviews that informed the policy and that have written and published work based on the interviews with sex workers, recognize that this is not an easy position for a human rights organization to reach. It took us 5 years to develop this policy, and that was because the human rights position is not entirely clear. So it took us some time to really dig into the standards and feel that, our research led us to a place where we believed that the appropriate interpretation was a decriminalization position. We have recommended often in our reports that governments, in addition to decriminalizing sex work and to making sure that sex workers are able to enforce all their human rights, also look at exit programs for sex workers, because we have indeed interviewed sex workers who talk about their desire to access other forms of employment. The fact that they're sex workers, the stigma, the fact that often they have criminal convictions is a very significant barrier to their exit from sex work. So in concluding, I think that what I would like to leave you with is that within this complicated and complex issue, the most important thing that I have taken away from my work is the need to pay attention to what the victims of these abuses are telling us and to try to act in ways that will support their agency and that will allow the development of laws, policies, and programs that support their human rights. Thank you very much.
I am thrilled to be here at Emory. These lights are horrible. You can't even imagine. I need a visor, sunglasses. And I want to thank the Thrower family for sponsoring this symposium and the Emory Law students who chose such a topical subject matter for this year, and Chelsea for all your help in getting us all here. Thank you. They're testing my diplomatic skills because they place me between women who have two very different opinions on this subject matter. They are testing my good government servant skills. In this day and age, I think it's really important to let you know that I worked and served in the US government for 23 years, and I'm very proud of that. And I have colleagues who are here from the US Attorney's Office here in Atlanta who are still continuing to prosecute these cases and work in this area, and so I thank you all for your continued service. But because I've been a government girl, I'm going to default to government policy in this area. and talk about a policy that came about under President George W. Bush in December of 2002. And I can talk about it because it is still U.S. policy. There is remarkable bipartisanship on the issue of trafficking, and this policy is still governing the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, where I worked for the past 2 years. And in 2002, the U.S. government adopted a strong position against legalized prostitution, based on evidence that prostitution is inherently harmful and dehumanizing, and that it fuels trafficking in persons, which we call now a form of modern-day slavery. And I have to say that the directive cited the work of Melissa Farley, our final panelist today, so it is an honor to be here with you and to have had such an impact on U.S. policy. The directive stated that prostitution and related activities, including pimping and patronizing or maintaining brothels, fuels the growth of modern-day slavery by providing a facade behind which traffickers for sexual exploitation operate. The presidential directive concluded that prostitution should not be regulated as a legitimate form of work for any human being. U.S. policy finds that where prostitution is legalized or tolerated, there is a greater demand for human trafficking victims, and nearly always an increase in the number of women and children trafficked into commercial sex slavery. Now, other countries have adopted laws that recognize the inherent harm in prostitution, and you've heard a lot today about the Nordic model. It has many names. It also goes by the sex buyer law, the Swedish or abolitionist model, or as Professor McKinnon noticed this morning, the equality model. And it decriminalizes all those who are prostituted and provides support services to help them exit. I'll talk a little bit about that. And the law has often stated as an objective that demand drives sex trafficking. It's been adopted not only in Sweden, but in Norway, Iceland, Northern Ireland, Canada, Ireland, and France. And France did an excellent job of putting into place programs for people who want to exit prostitution in terms of services and job training in their law. So it's very comprehensive. And as more countries adopt it, there's more need for academic study in that area to see the results of these projects. Professor Leary brought out some numbers about the number of individuals around the world who are trafficked. It is the most recent number from September of last year from the International Labor Organization and the Walk Free Foundation in partnership with IOM, the International Organization of Migration, is about 40 million. But the new estimates also show that women and girls are disproportionately affected by modern slavery, accounting for almost 29 million, or 71% of the overall total. Women represent 99% of all victims of forced labor in the commercial sex industry. So Sweden's argument and other countries that adopted it really looked at organized criminal networks and what role they play in the sex industry, and found that they don't register with the government, even in a legalized system, that they don't pay taxes, and they don't protect prostitutes. Sweden and other countries believe that it is easier for traffickers to blend in when prostitution is legalized. And they found that much of the vast profit generated goes into the hands of criminals. So to fight human trafficking, after passing this equality law for women in Sweden, they aggressively prosecuted buyers. I like to call them offenders. There are different terms, as you can see in this area, that kind of indicate where your stance is on certain issues. And as a result of this aggressive prosecution of the offenders under the Swedish law, 2 years after the policy there was a 50% decrease in women in prostitution and a 75% decrease in men buying sex. So in contrast, Nordic model countries argue that where prostitution is legalized or allowed, there's an increase in the demand that fuels sex trafficking and the number of victimized foreign women in particular. So in the US, clearly prostitution is illegal, and we can still prosecute both buyers and sellers, both men and women typically. I'm not going to go down the path that Professor McKinnon went down this morning. One thing, I'm not as smart as her, and the other is I haven't been doing this as long. She gave a brilliant speech this morning, and we certainly appreciate your intellect on this. But I will talk about some areas that I feel like we can all reach agreement on. This is that diplomatic dance I alluded to. Certainly, starting with children and child sex trafficking. There was a wonderful organization out of LA called No Such Thing as a Child Prostitute. And I think it's really important to think about that, because when I started prosecuting these cases here in Georgia, children were getting locked up for prostitution. This was before the Federal Trafficking Victim Protection Act, before Georgia enacted its law. There was a juvenile court judge here, and none of us know what's going on in most of our local courts. You hear about one or two trials that are media sensationalized. And this judge said, I need to tell the community in Georgia what's coming into my courtroom. 13, 14, 15, and 16-year-old girls coming in for prostitution charges, back then still outdoors on a street where law enforcement could see them, arrested, given a criminal charge, and bonded out by the same adult men over and over. And she woke up Atlanta to this problem that was happening here. And luckily for me, I got to serve on the first federal prosecution even before we had a TVPA. We charged the traffickers under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, under RICO. And we got to work on that case and let people know that there is no such thing as a child prostitute. A child cannot consent to this. And that organization in Los Angeles has done a really good job of raising media awareness around this and educating people that these young girls cannot consent to this act. And we still have issues with law enforcement struggling with that, and with struggling with what force, fraud, and coercion look like for adult women. And so we have to keep working and training law enforcement in this area as to how broad the definition of trafficking is. The coercion, the deception that Dahlia referred to earlier, I used to say it's any lie the trafficker told you. That's part of the fraud that got many of these young women and adults engaged in prostitution that they did not want to engage in. And it's important to talk about what these elements are that influence individuals and what influence adults. Because by criminalizing adults, one of my other early cases here, there were adult women who were being trafficked by a man that they didn't live with. And so they automatically didn't understand that they could be trafficking victims. They were engaging in prostitution on his behalf under his duress and coercion. But they didn't come forward. They didn't come forward until we had indicted some other victims in the case. And then they came down and they said, who thought law enforcement would believe us? Who thought they would look at us as victims of this man? We thought we'd get arrested. We thought we'd get prosecuted. And it was only when we had a federal case against their traffickers that more victims came forward. There still is that stigma for many people who don't think that law enforcement will believe them and don't want to get involved with law enforcement that they may not trust. So it was very important to when we talk about trafficking prosecutions and trafficking policy, to take a victim-centered approach to these crimes. And that victim-centered approach can vary, but I think, again, there's some areas, some common areas we can agree on. Professor McKinnon this morning talked about the stigma that follows a prostitution conviction and why that's important to the Nordic model to remove that stigma. There are now states in the U.S. that are passing laws to protect victims of trafficking from having a criminal record follow them. New York was one of the first states to pass a vacature or expungement law, and they directed it just at prostitution-related offenses. Florida went further and passed a law that allows trafficking victims to expunge or remove any criminal conviction for a nonviolent crime committed as a direct result of being trafficked. So it still wouldn't solve some of the sensational cases we hear about where someone is killed, a trafficking victim kills their trafficker, but it would solve other nonviolent convictions, drugs, theft, prostitution, other offenses like that. And that's important not just for the job application that Professor McKinnon referenced this morning, for housing benefits, for the ability to chaperone your kid's school trip in some cases. I mean, things that just will follow you around forever if you're not allowed to remove those convictions. And it's challenging to talk about this issue because there is no universal understanding of best practices, but I believe that globally we are coming to the recognition that not stigmatizing victims of trafficking is a step we can all agree on, and certainly one that I championed while I was ambassador in the TIP office. And back to the TIP office, one of the things that office does is produce a trafficking in persons report every year that comes out and ranks efforts on behalf of governments to combat trafficking. And the government efforts are evaluated under 4 minimum standards given to us by the TVPA, and then 12 indicia of serious and sustained efforts by the government under the last standard. And the last indicia is whether the government has made serious and sustained efforts to reduce the demand for commercial sex acts. And there's an argument that legalizing commercial sex will not reduce the demand, and in fact will have the opposite effect, particularly given the US policy that prostitution fuels trafficking in persons. So how, as a diplomat and a US government official, do you engage with countries that have different laws relating to legalization of prostitution? Well, you focus on common interests. You think people don't like people from Washington in the US? They really don't like people from Washington coming over to their country and telling them what's wrong with their laws. So I tried not to start from that perspective. I tried to start from the perspective of what are our common interests in this area? How can we educate law enforcement to look for the indicators of this crime and not prosecute victims? How can we pursue a victim-centered approach that when a victim is recovered, her needs are addressed, she's given a job, she's given skills, she's allowed to assist in the prosecution? I met with an organization in France, an NGO there, again, France having recently adopted this model, and they were really working hard with police to encourage them to enforce this new law against purchasers and provide services to those who wanted to exit commercial sex work. In France's law, and many of the Nordic models do have these programs. I also was fortunate enough to spend some time working in New Zealand after they had legalized prostitution. And I just, being a courtroom lawyer, I love stories, and I find this story of the passage of their law very instructive. So the Prostitution Reform Bill in New Zealand originated as a member's bill, meaning it wasn't sponsored by any particular party, but by an individual member of parliament. And while I won't deliver it in a Kiwi accent, this is what he said. The injustices in the present law are plain and predictable and real. The last 5 years have seen 410 people convicted, countless hours of police time engaged on essentially moral and unproductive crusades, and genuine criminality hidden from view by the secrecy and mystery generated by current prostitution law. And so he wanted to reform the law, what he called removing layers of Victorian hypocrisy, scraping off the abuse of sex workers, washing away public health dangers, and replacing it with this legalized law. Now, I'll contrast New Zealand, where they had 410 people arrested, to the US, where we arrest about 55,000 annually for prostitution offenses. And so this MP highlights the arguments behind legalization. But interestingly, the law passed in New Zealand by 1 vote, and 1 MP abstained from voting. So it was 60 to 59 with 1 abstention. And if the person abstained had voted against it, if it had been a tie, the law would not have passed by 1 vote on the barest of margins. And they really focused a lot, as Liesl indicated, on health consequences, and in fact included a provision to fine individuals up to $2,000 if they didn't practice safe sex. And so after that law, legalizing prostitution in New Zealand, and looking at the US law, which I also was intimately familiar with, where we still have an illegal framework, I found that in both countries, though, you still had a judicial bias against victims of trafficking, no matter what your legal framework was for the crime of prostitution. In New Zealand, there was a prosecution I examined, a young girl who was 16, and the brothel owner recruited her. When she told him, "I'm 16, he said, "Oh, we can work around that." And he had this 16-year-old working for 12 hours a day, sometimes seeing 4 to 5 clients, on heavy days, 8 to 10. And he told her that she would split the money with him. So she did get some financial remuneration from this. And the court noted that. The court noted, oh, she got something for it, and he was out offering her protection. She wasn't out on the street. So still in a framework where it was criminal for a juvenile to be engaged in prostitution, but that prostitution itself had been legalized, the victim was still receiving some of the blame for the crime. And similarly, here in the US, I had a case that a colleague prosecuted where a trafficker brought his girlfriend, very common trafficking scenario in the US, from Arkansas to Atlanta, and he prostituted her along the way at truck stops. She was 15. And as I said, it was her boyfriend. She had been sexually active with him. And when the judge sentenced the trafficker, she noted that the victim was rather worldly before she became involved with the trafficker. So the judge here commented on the victim's sexual activity prior to being trafficked. And so no matter what the framework, I think we have to be on the lookout for judges who are biased against victims of trafficking and those who engage in are placed in prostitution or engage in sex work. You can see I'm trying to use all the terms so you can't tell where I fall on this. But it is important, and I'll end where I began, which is the U.S. position is that prostitution is inherently harmful. And the directive went on to state that some of the statistics you've heard, that 95% of people in prostitution want to leave, that the common age of entry into prostitution is when you're a juvenile, 14, 15, 16 years old. And then the policy went on to say, because this is U.S. view of prostitution, we aren't going to provide funding, federal funding, to NGOs or international organizations that support legalized prostitution. We're not going to put our federal monies behind programs that we think lead to trafficking. So while we have those restrictions in place still, and we don't fund those countries that want, or those organizations that want to legalize prostitution, I do think it's important to find common ground for us to work on, no matter our views in the prostitution realm, to continue to combat trafficking and to support those who have been subject to it, either by virtue of their age or by virtue of force, fraud, or coercion. I will say that the Nordic model believes that prostitution is not the oldest profession, but the oldest form of oppression. And that we, regardless of where we fall on that continuum, need to focus on the rights of victims, on decriminalizing or vacating any convictions they have, and on helping them transition back into other work in our society. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Chelsea Holler. Thank you, Thrower Symposium. And thank you, Emory, for inviting me to be here. Speaking about sexual abuse, a woman said, "It was way, way, way too much. Each time that I was taking it again and again, it just felt like more of me diminishing, just getting smaller until it was like a shell of a person." When I first read this account, I assumed I was reading a description of prostitution. No. This was an account of a woman automobile factory worker in Chicago describing what it was like when her boss abused her on the job. Another woman described her response to sexual abuse at the Ford factory. No person should have to endure that. You have to force yourself into a place of not feeling anything, of not having any emotion to exist. These descriptions of what it feels like to be sexually harassed on the job are identical to what women's descriptions are of what prostitution feels like. In a creative response to the question, can pornography plots be distinguished from accounts of sexual abuse? A Dutch team asked men if stories they read were from pornography or from Me Too accounts. Guess what? They couldn't tell the difference. The supremacist logic of the man who has more power than a woman and who sexually exploits her, whether he's her boss, doctor, lawyer, teacher, president, is the same as the sex buyer. He thinks, I pay you, so I own you, so I can do anything I want to you. Wherever there's sexual harassment, a certain group of women are split off from other women. Prostitution is set apart from everything that people are Me Tooing about, said Evelina Giobbi. People would not be appalled if Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby or Woody Allen did what they did to prostituted women. Now, why is that? It's because a special caste of prostituted women is created in order to guarantee men unconditional sexual access to women. Before I knew anything about prostitution, I was a psychologist in a practice where, like many others, I saw that many of women's mental health problems resulted from men's violence and abuse. And one day in 1992, someone called me up and asked me if I'd write a letter of protest because a San Francisco government commission to study prostitution was trying to silence a survivor who wanted to speak about prostitution. She was too negative, the commission said. She talked about things like getting kicked in the head by her pimp and getting raped by the men who bought her. I wrote the letter, she and I met, and since the local government commission would still not accept her testimony, she and I decided to study prostitution in San Francisco. We got that study published, people heard about it. We formed 2 nonprofit organizations. Hers was a survivor-led service agency, and I founded Prostitution Research and Education, a nonprofit research institute that focuses exclusively on studying prostitution and trafficking. 10 years later, a study of prostitution in 9 countries was published. Fast forward to 2016, when Amnesty International ran a more sophisticated denial campaign crafted by a UK pimp. With lots of slogans and little empirical data, Amnesty advocated the decriminalization not just of those in prostitution, which I agree is a good idea, but they proposed decriminalizing buying sex and pimping. We have a denial of the facts problem. I'm going to talk about some ways that our inquiries and attempts to expand the discussion about prostitution are shut down, facts dismissed, and new information rejected. Public misconceptions about prostitution stem from sex buyers and pimps cover narratives about the violence perpetrated against women in prostitution. Men's justifications for other forms of violence against women are remarkably similar to justifications for prostitution. They blame the victim, viewing women in prostitution as somehow intrinsically different from other women and as morally deficient even. Sex buyers justify prostitution by telling us she's getting rich or she's simply doing an unpleasant but necessary job like factory work. Sex buyers and sex trade advocates may acknowledge a tiny fraction of the abuse and exploitation in prostitution, but they justify the abuse because the women are alleged to make a lot of money. Once paid for, the exploitation, abuse, and rape are disappeared. An Italian sex buyer said, "Oh yeah, all of them are exploited, but they also have good incomes." Another sex buyer that I interviewed described rapes of a woman by her pimp, but he said it was only once in a while, not even every week. Why do we look away from the extreme inequality between the sex buyer and the prostituted? Much information about prostitution comes from sex trade advocates and profiteers who run campaigns of risk denial. Doubt is created through attacks on empirical research, appearances by rich, high-class escorts on TV, and other carefully crafted pro-sex trade propaganda. Now, a number of prominent advocates who are easy for the media to access identify publicly only as sex workers, although they are in fact managers of the sex trade. Some are pimps, some have been arrested for pandering, brothel managing, or trafficking. There's a blatant conflict of interest when individuals who are management owners, pimps, are in the same organization as people under their control. The misrepresentation is even more unethical when these folks hide their affiliations, claiming to represent the interests of sex workers. Hiding beneath the banner of labor unions, pimps appeal to the left's sympathies. Yet groups such as the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, the International Union of Sex Workers in the UK, SWEAT, the Sex Workers Education and Alliance Task Force in South Africa, the DMSC in India, Stella in Canada, SWAP USA, Sex Workers Organizing Project, many of whom may be funded by people we know well, like George Soros. While these groups aggressively promote prostitution as work, but they're nothing like what most of us think of as labor unions. They don't offer pensions, safety, shorter hours, unemployment benefits, or exit services, which, as other speakers have said, 90% of those in prostitution have said they want exit services. Instead, these groups promote a free market in human beings who are used for sex. We've located 12 people from 8 countries who publicly identify as sex workers or sex worker advocates, but who've been implicated in the management of sex trade businesses in various specific ways. All of them promote decriminalized pimping, and many have been arrested for trafficking, pandering, interstate prostitution, or living off the earnings of prostitution. Be careful who you're quoting in this field. Pimps and sex trade entrepreneurs orchestrate denial that's much like the tobacco industries or the climate change denialist playbook. The facts are turned upside down, fantasy replaces reality, and in response to the avalanche of evidence demonstrating harms from smoking, tobacco manufacturers argued 3 things. 1, tobacco is not harmful to smokers. 2, that the smoker's cancer was caused by other factors. And 3, that smokers assumed the risk of cancer when they made the decision to smoke. This is ignoring their advertising campaigns. That's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. The climate change denialist playbook and the prostitution harm denialist playbook are very, very similar. I've just published a table comparing the 2 modes of denial. Things like fixing the problem of climate harm damage would be too expensive. It would kill jobs. It would wreck the economy. And on the sex work prostitution side, sex work is necessary for women's economic survival. On the climate harm denial side, fixing the problem would undermine personal freedom. We advocate zero regulation. We're defending the free market from government intrusion. Government regulation is a slippery slope leading to communism. And on the sex work advocate side, sex workers have the right to do what they want with their own bodies. And the sex trade slogan, "Get the government off my body," opposes government regulation from the liberal left. So they're very similar arguments all down the line, and it's published on our website, prostitutionresearch.com. It's called "When the Person is the Product." So we have a word problem. Just as the words field worker or assistant planter deny the harms of slavery, and those words were really used, so also the concept of sex work disappears the violence in prostitution as work. Men who buy women in prostitution are called interested parties, hobbyists, and pimps are called managers. We have a social media problem. In the field of trafficking and prostitution, most of us know how social media plays a role in finding and grooming victims. Some of the other panelists have talked about that today. Instagram, Snapchat, Kik, Twitter, Facebook are all used to scout victims. WhatsApp is now being used by pimps to monitor the negotiation between the sex buyer and the woman he's buying for sex to make sure the pimp gets all the money. And it provides him with increased control over her. Pornographers developed algorithms to push more extreme internet content and to move the viewer from viewing to buying sex. Today, YouTube's algorithms push what's next videos after you search on a given topic, right? We all, more funny cat videos or something. And then you get to the bottom of the list of what they're recommending, and it pushes you into more extreme content. A former algorithm programmer concluded that YouTube, which was purchased by Google in 2006, systematically amplifies videos that are divisive, sensational, and conspiratorial. Fiction outperforms reality. A Trumpian dismissal of facts as fake is today undermining people's confidence in their own ability to know what's real. Wikipedia is a prime example of creating biased and non-fact-based reality, with anonymous editors skewing and biasing the facts and deleting information. Wikipedia pages on the sex trade, prostitution, trafficking, any of that, are reversed by robots within seconds if you try and correct any factual errors. Paid lobbyists or astroturfers attack those they disagree with on Wikipedia. Cheryl Atkinson at the University of Nevada has studied these online astroturf campaigns or fake grassroots campaigns. Lobbying interests disguise themselves, publish fake news, start social media accounts on Facebook and Twitter, and astroturfers controversialize those who disagree with them. For example, I learned that Wikipedia pages on some medical conditions contradict peer-reviewed medical research 90% of the time. Take, for example, uses of a cholesterol-lowering drug. Critics of the drug are called cranks, quacks, and nuts. These kind of inflammatory, personally insulting words are hallmarks of astroturfing. It often turns out that the doctors who touted it and called the cancer link a myth, ridiculed critics, or who served on government panels, these are all paid consultants for the drug company. That's who we're listening to. Wikipedia is an astroturfer's dream come true. They claim to debunk myths, which are not myths at all, and they controversialize issues by attacking personalities, people, or organizations, rather than addressing the facts or discussing the facts. We truly live in an artificial paid-for reality, and this makes it really hard to distinguish facts from lies. The dilemma for those who wield power in the sex trade is to hide its cruelty and to make it palatable to those who use it and who watch human beings as they're being cruelly exploited. But as a survivor of prostitution said, it's like incest, nobody wants to talk about it. The big lies from pimps, sex buyers, and their political allies on social media can seem overwhelming, but the evidence regarding the harms of prostitution is a problem for them. The testimony of survivors is a big problem for them, and the truth provided by anonymous sex buyers in research interviews destroys the notion that prostitution is a service provided by sex workers. I hope some of this will help you sort through the barrage of misinformation on prostitution, trafficking, and pornography. You know, there are programs to teach young children and young men how to deconstruct the messages in pornography. And I just learned yesterday that the Swedes are now teaching elementary school children how to identify fake news. I think these are really good ideas. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful presentation. We now have some time for questions. Could you just mention your name, say to whom the question is made, and not make a speech, but just ask a question. If you will go to the microphones. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Tyler. I guess my question is most naturally, but not exclusively, directed to Ambassador Coppage. With inexperience at the State Department by people like Secretary Tillerson and Ambassador Haley, and a mass exodus of ambassadors, are we losing our practical authority to impact international sex trafficking efforts?
So, as I mentioned, before I was in the elevated position of ambassador, I was a career government worker. And there are still many dedicated career government workers doing their jobs at the State Department and the Department of Justice. And for them, I am grateful. It is challenging when you are trying to put out any message, not to have your people speaking for you. And this particular White House does not have positions filled, as you've read in the media, across many federal agencies, particularly the State Department. I was comforted to see today that the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, is pulling back on his reorganization campaign at the State Department, and it's really now just about making impact changes to make us more efficient and effective as diplomats. So I think that Congress never supported the drawdown of the State Department's budget. There are friends on both sides of the aisles in Congress that support these issues and other diplomatic issues. I think other individuals in the administration at the Secretary of Defense certainly recognizes the value of having diplomacy as well as a military presence. And so I think that there still are people trying to get the message out there. It is obviously a very challenging time. That was my diplomatic courtesy.
Any further questions?
Hi, my name is David, and this is a question in response to something that you said, Susan Coppage, but it applies to the entire panel. And so you were talking about the biases that sex workers face from employment, from healthcare, from the criminal justice system itself. And I was wondering, do you think that's a solution for a legal regime to solve in terms of whether they criminalize or decriminalize, or if that extends beyond that to other sort of solutions?
Yeah, I certainly think it extends beyond the legal framework the country has adopted. I think that regardless of the framework, people who aren't in a position of power suffer from prejudices and just kind of the unknown. People don't know them. And so trafficking victims are by definition vulnerable for some reason, or they would not have been susceptible to the force, fraud, and coercion that place them in trafficking. And so it's very hard to tell their story to people who have never experienced being disempowered, right? What judge is going to understand why a trafficking victim goes along with something when, by definition, that person has always succeeded and put themselves forward and been strong? And so I think it's very challenging to tell the story of a trafficking victim to someone in a position of power, whether that's a judge or law enforcement. Some of my colleagues, when I first started prosecuting these cases, they just didn't get what I now call the victim-centered mindset. And so I think that's important no matter what legal framework you're operating under, is to take a step back and look at it from the victim's perspective. And U.S. and international law is very generous in this area because it says from the perspective of a person in the reasonable victim's position. So you can look at all the factors that contributed to their decision-making and proving why the trafficker was able to overcome their will.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Alan. My question is for the entire panel. What is your opinion on the portrayal of sexuality, and I guess in particular prostitutes, in popular media like Game of Thrones, Westworld, other shows that depict it? And how should we approach those?
I have not watched Game of Thrones, but I will say that I think that there has been a tendency to glamorize sex work. So I think the images that we often see are, there are two sets of images that I've seen. I think one is sort of the glamorized young woman who has glossy hair and good shoes and who's putting herself through Harvard and doing sex work on the side. And I think as some of the people during the course of the day said, that's a very, very, very small minority of people. The other form that I think is also problematic is you sort of completely only portraying them as one-dimensional victims that don't portray traffic victims or sex workers or anyone kind of as more multi-dimensional human beings. So, the only aspect to their identity that popular culture is interested in is their victimhood. And I think that, both those stereotypes are pretty problematic.
Have you ever seen Birth of a Nation? I think most of what's out there is a technologically advanced version of Birth of a Nation in terms of an accurate presentation of what prostitution is. I would say there's some incredible documentaries out there. There are tapes of survivors of exited survivors speaking. And I would argue that the testimony of an exited survivor carries a different weight from the testimony of somebody who is currently under duress. I've actually spoken to exited survivors who said that at the time they appeared on Larry King or some talk show, their pimp was in the sidelines ordering them to say X, Y, and Z about prostitution. So I think we, again, as I was trying to point out in my remarks, we have to be pretty careful about the nature of the testimony we're listening to, the motivation of the people. Is it a financial motivation? Are they under any kind of duress? There is a failure in our movement to understand the myriad of techniques of coercive mental control that's used in prostitution. We're not talking about a gun to the head or a kidnapping like in Taken, which I have all kinds of problems with too, because most prostitution is done under the force and coercion of poverty, of racism, and of being female. And today, geographic vulnerability. You live in a place where the sea level is rising, and you're going to have to think about moving, and that makes you more vulnerable.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sally Holler, and I'm Chelsea's mom, and she's done a great job. We've really enjoyed it.
Good work, Mom!
We flew in from Orlando, Florida this morning, and we've had a great time, and it's been very informative. And one of the things that kind of lends after you were just talking about the victims and the prostitutes that want to get out, have we ever thought about, or do we have the government funds or resources to help these women maybe have relocation and new identity so that they can get out and away from the traps that keep pulling them back in?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we don't have enough services. We don't have enough bed space, even for juveniles, which we purport to, protecting our children is our number one priority as a community and a society. And we don't have enough bed space for the children that are trafficked or molested or in need of services. So there certainly aren't enough services for those who want to exit. being prostituted. So it's challenging. It's certainly challenging. Nothing is fancy, I'm losing my words, as an identification change program. But again, why it's even more important to vacate criminal convictions or expunge criminal convictions, the law uses both terms, so that that doesn't follow you around. Really interesting problem for me when I was prosecuting. A lot of the victims are brought in from overseas, which adds another level of vulnerability because they are fearful of our Homeland Security law enforcement and don't want to communicate with them. But at some point, if you are a trafficking victim from another country, you can get what's called a T visa, and you can stay here. And it puts you on a path to citizenship. But one of the questions on the citizenship form, they ask if you've ever been convicted of a crime, but they also ask if you've ever been involved in prostitution. So it's the only crime that's singled out on our immigration paperwork. And I'm so afraid that a victim of trafficking won't know how to answer that question. They want to be truthful because that affects whether they are allowed to stay in the country. But they also don't want to tell anyone that they were involved in prostitution. And we need to have the law recognize the difference of being compelled, coerced, tricked into prostitution, and if there is a choice, to recognize that difference. So it's not just housing and jobs, it has immigration consequences. As I mentioned, there was a horrible story of a woman who couldn't go chaperone her child's first grade field trip. All these consequences that stem from it. So we really need to protect their records.
Okay, can I just say a quick thing to that? There's a 75% overlap between homelessness and prostitution. If that tells you anything about who is exchanging or tolerating or acceding to sexual assault in order to stay inside when it's 30 degrees or raining. So we live in very, very difficult times. Women are now in the US prostituting for hamburgers and for a tank of gas. So when they don't have homes, it's a big problem. And here we are dismantling, we have a tragic government, people in our top levels of our government right now who are dismantling any kind of safety net for women. And I think despite disagreements, there is general agreement, I hope, on one thing. Women should have the right, the human right, to stay out of prostitution if that is their choice. It's not usually framed that way. It's usually framed by the pimps and johns as they're making a choice to prostitute. That's about 3 or 5% of people, usually very class and race privileged. The other 90% are telling us they want out, and I think we can all get behind they should have that right to be out of prostitution if they choose that.
And now these 2 more questions.
I'm Melanie Casepier. In speaking to the differences of perspectives, I was curious what gave each perspective its confidence. I understand that from other prosecutors here that they also have found similar findings of where you legalize prostitution, trafficking seems to go up, whereas we have some international perspectives that say, no, this helps. I thought it was a great point to bring in the aggressive prosecution behind the equality law. Where does each side get its confidence for that conviction when both are so, I guess they stand so tall? Did that make sense?
Can you just say the question? I'm sorry. I appreciate it.
My apologies. To be more straightforward,
Where do you get your data?
why does each side have the confidence that it does on concerning legalizing prostitution? Obviously, both sides feel very strongly that in legalizing it, it helps survivors who are being trafficked, while the other seems to say that that's not the case. It increases trafficking and its ills. Where do you each find your sources for this to really stand behind it when you both have such strong points.
Well, let me say that I don't think anyone on this panel is proposing legalizing prostitution. Human Rights Watch's position is that we should decriminalize sex work, which means that ultimately, as I hope I laid out clearly, that would mean that people engaged in sex work, predominantly women, would not be subject to criminal conviction, would be able to exercise a full range of their human rights. I mean, this is a deeply contested field, and I think as Melissa has laid out, there's lots of dodgy information out there. There's lots of contested information that is being interpreted differently depending on which bias. I mean, I come to the position that I've reached on the basis of the work that Human Rights Watch has done, interviewing a range of stakeholders in this. So that's my starting point. But it is probably the most divisive issue within the human rights movement, within the feminist movement. It's hard to think of an issue that raises stronger feelings and where there are such strong differences of opinions. When I said that it took Human Rights Watch 5 years to develop the policy, that was partly because there is a gap in the international legal framework, but it was also partly because we could not reach agreement. It took us 5 years of intensive discussions to get to a place where we could agree on decriminalization. So it's a difficult issue.
Final question?
Can I just say, I mean, if you look at the peer-reviewed data, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to do it. You cannot look at Wikipedia. You cannot listen to podcasts from someone's blog. You've got to look at the peer-reviewed data. If you look at that stuff, Cho and Dreyer, 150 countries were studied. Every place where prostitution was legalized, there was a trend to increase trafficking. The peer-reviewed data on trafficking's relationship to legal prostitution is out there. I've been in legal brothels in Germany and in Nevada, and I can tell you that is some of the most horrific human rights abuses I've ever seen. I would say if anyone's going to talk about that, you better go to Nevada and you better look into some legal prostitution. It's disturbing, to put it mildly. I am not aware. I welcome anyone presenting me with peer-reviewed studies that show that legal prostitution increases the safety of those in prostitution. Decriminalized prostitution is one type of legal prostitution. It is, of course, always zoned out of the neighborhoods of the city fathers into the neighborhoods of recent immigrants and poor people and people of color, like prostitution is any place that it's legalized or decriminalized. In New Zealand, we have statements in the government's own report that incidents of coercive control by pimps, who are now called brothel managers under decriminalized prostitution, that the same amount of coercive control was happening, that trafficking from international trafficking was increasing, that the harassment of women on the street who were not prostituting went up hundreds of times. There's lots of evidence out there about the harms of legal or decriminalized prostitution. I've got cards up here. I'm happy to email you anything you want on it, and anybody else. I'll be your reference librarian on this topic.
My question actually deals with the criminalization of human trafficking from an immigration perspective. The whole talk, I was wondering about what the economic costs are to U.S. taxpayers of resolving this problem. And I think a young lady over on this side asked a similar question. And I know that, for example, in the immigration perspective, what are the costs of ICE detention for the pimp and the victim? The victim might qualify for asylum. What are the costs of getting asylum granted? And then after asylum is granted, what are the continued costs of victim maintenance? I know that in federal and state drug trafficking cases, there are minimum restitution fines that have to be paid. And I want to know what the possibility is of child pornographers and pimps and people who are profiting from human trafficking would have to pay, and those funds go into a specific program to support victim maintenance and immigration consequences, which are collateral, but which happen to the victims because they have to go through a process to be able to stay here, and that costs money.
So under the Federal Trafficking Victim Protection Act, and I'm pretty sure under most state laws which model it, there's a mandatory restitution provision for trafficking victims of any kind, labor or sex trafficking. And I always sought that in the cases I prosecuted. The reality is that a lot of traffickers don't leave their money laying around or put it in bank accounts, so it's either gone back to the country of origin or it's been spent to live this lavish lifestyle. So we have restitution ordered, but that's for the victim. That's goes back to them if there is any money there. The services that are provided are provided to trafficking victims like they are to other refugees. So if they need initially social services, English as a second language classes, those are provided. Medical services are provided. But in most cases, the trafficking victim is here because they were vulnerable economically and wanted to better their lives. And so it has been my experience, anecdotally, that every foreign-born trafficking victim gets out and works, completes their education, does something productive because they were susceptible, because they wanted to improve their station. And the ones I have worked with have jobs and are out there doing that. Those are the foreign-born victims. It's different for U.S. because there are other vulnerabilities. Typically in the U.S. there can be traffickers have preyed on those with drug problems, if you heard, mental handicaps, those who have been abused sexually in the home. So other services may be needed for U.S. victims. And Congress has been, again, very generous in the anti-trafficking arena on a bipartisan level, giving money to more services. We just need more still.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me again in thanking our panelists. Can I just say, before calling on Chelsea, I mentioned the International Justice Commission in Washington, D.C., and the organization in Cape Town. For the sake of the students, there are internships available in those organizations.
I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who's here today. You coming shows the interest that we all have in uniting to do the right thing. And so I appreciate it, and I just encourage each of us to do our best to dive into the research, go beyond what you see at the top of the Google page, and keep learning more. And thank you so much for being here. We'll have a reception outside. You're welcome to have food and talk with some of the people who are there, and thank you so much. Bye.